It's June 2016, and this is episode 53 of the Unseen Podcast. The Unseen Podcast is the unedited, unscripted, Creative Commons open participation spinoff of the Wow Signal. For more information on the Wow Signal, go to wowsignalpodcast.com. For more information on this podcast, go to unseenpodcast.com. Tonight, joining me are Adam Smith.
Hi, Paul. Hello, everybody.
I should point out Adam got up at 3 o'clock in the morning to join this podcast from England. We have Marsha Barnhart.
Hello from Cadillac, Michigan, everyone.
And we have, I should have said the dangerous Marsha Barnhart. And we have Nick Nielsen.
Hello, Paul, and hello, everyone listening.
Now, tonight, we were expecting Sam Lichtenstein. He couldn't make it at the last minute. So the subject that we more or less agreed on, and by the way, we start discussing the subject for the podcast about 4 weeks out. And everybody in the participant community is welcome to chime in on what they think the subject ought to be, or what we call the topic. And it may be more than one topic for a night. Sometimes we have 3 or 4 topics. Sometimes we have one. Tonight, I think we're just going to have one, although we'll see where it takes us. We are quite happy to entertain creative tangents as long as they don't get too bogged down. Even where I work at NASA, meetings often go off on tangents and stay there for many, 15, 20 minutes at a time until somebody decides, hey, we're off on a tangent, let's reel it in. So my job is to reel it in if necessary. If not necessary, I won't. So let's get started. The topic that we were thinking of is the future of human conflict, in particular human conflict as humanity expands into the solar system, and the problems that we might get into with not only the conflict itself, but the debris from the conflict and lots of maybe other issues I haven't even thought of yet. So let's get started. Who wants to go first? What do you think the prospects are?
Well, I'll start if no one else will.
Go ahead.
It's interesting that you immediately qualified. We talked initially about talking about space war, which explains the qualification of human conflict as we move out into the solar system. But I think one of the most interesting lessons of the 20th century is the Cold War, which was a war of a different kind. And I think that as human civilization changes, we will see new kinds of war emerge. And the most obvious kind of very new kind of war that can emerge would be cyber warfare, which is being studied intensively by many different nation states and their security services. And there have already been several concentrated attacks on the internet infrastructure of various nation states and institutions, and even private businesses that are believed to be closely associated with nation states. So space war is certainly something that we should talk about and something we should be thinking about, but it can't be separated from the new kinds of wars and new forms of conflict that may emerge that we can't even imagine today. Like 30 years ago, it would have been very difficult to explain someone how destructive cyber warfare could be, and now we have a pretty good idea of how destructive it could be.
Right. Well, what's the worst case we've seen so far? Was it the Sony break-in, or what was it?
Well, that's a hacking and a dump of information, and so you could compare that. If you want to talk about spectacular dumps of information, certainly Snowden's dump of the NSA information, or the Bradley/Chelsea Manning dump of information that became WikiLeaks' big trove. So that I wouldn't really put under the category of cyber warfare. Obviously, it's a political question. If you're going to, some people straight up call it treason. Some people call it hacking. People have other names for it.
Some people think Snowden's a hero.
Myself among them. I don't think the democratic society should have massive dragnet surveillance that doesn't distinguish among people without a warrant.
Here, here.
But is that warfare? Well, maybe it is. Maybe it's a new kind of warfare where individuals and small groups of hackers can go up against nation states on nearly as peer-to-peer combat, as it were, in cyberspace. But we've already seen there've been coordinated attacks on several different countries. The Russian hackers, presumably financed by the Kremlin, were accused of attacking the infrastructure of several Baltic nation states, and some U.S. assets have been targeted by hackers believed to have been financed by and run by North Korea. So there have been some high stakes break-ins and theft of information, and of course espionage, which could be considered an adjunct of conflict or warfare. One of the interesting things about it is so difficult to draw the line as to what would constitute a cyber war and what would not. And I honestly haven't read all that much on this. I would have been a little bit more prepared to give you a string of instances.
Okay. Well, let's not get too deeply into it, except that you're right. I mean, that is a kind of a new battleground that has not been, we didn't anticipate probably 50 years ago.
Kind of at this point, you almost want to nail down now what we would call warfare then, right? How are we going to define warfare? Espionage isn't warfare. So is probing somebody's weakness, in their cyber space, that doesn't constitute warfare. So what now are we going to call warfare?
I think in the case of warfare, you're doing anything you can to impose your will on the enemy or to keep him from imposing his will on you, right? So, and you don't care how much damage it does to him. And you also don't care very much how much damage it does to you, as long as it's sustainable. And that kind of warfare, we're talking about, would be really attempts to do things like bring down the power grid of a country, damage its industry, damage its manufacturing, damage, really make material damage on a country, not just espionage. Now, espionage is crucial to warfare, even though espionage, I agree with you, espionage is not warfare by itself. Espionage can be just to gain a material advantage in commercial purposes. I don't know how many of you have ever seen the HBO comedy Silicon Valley. There's a lot of espionage going on in that show, and I'm told it's fairly realistic what they show there. That people stealing each other's trade secrets by any means necessary, right? But that's not warfare so much. That's just
exploiting weaknesses.
That's just being sneaky bastards.
Which
has been going on for millennia, right?
But there are forms of limited warfare, and certainly the Cold War was an example of limited warfare. It was a quid pro quo. You don't nuclear bomb us, and we don't nuclear bomb you, but we will continue to finance guerrillas and irregular and asymmetrical warfare against you as long as we don't go over the nuclear threshold. And we certainly could expect to see absolute cyber warfare, but also limited forms of cyber warfare. We might say there might be a tacit quid pro quo. We won't bring down your electrical grid if you don't bring down your electrical grid, but we're still going to try to do what harm to you we can within that context.
Right, or just bring down the financial system, for example, which some people think can't be done, but other people think can be. I mean, it's kind of a matter of opinion at this point. Another television series, Mr. Robot, went into great depth on what it takes to bring down the financial system, where a group of anarchists succeeded in doing it. But you know, what if the Chinese decided to bring down the Western financial system? Could they do it? I don't know. But that would certainly do damage in the West and potentially allow China to impose their will in the West.
It would also do damage to the Chinese since they hold so much U.S. government debt.
Well,
But
that's true, but they may be willing to sustain that damage if they can get what they want.
They may be.
When we commonly talk about warfare now, though, where most people are talking about near Earth space, the satellites and all of the hardware we've got up there that is making our capabilities what they are now. So it's cyberspace warfare and it's near Earth space warfare. And I think that's where it's pretty hinky right now. And I know that the U.S. is very, very concerned about losing their capabilities up there in near space.
Yes, well, it's pretty easy to build an anti-satellite weapon. It's actually not that high tech because satellite, a piece of metal the size of a golf ball can rip a satellite to shreds.
Yeah, but a lot of the military stuff is hardened and
it's not
evasion. And
when you're talking about something hitting you at 15 kilometers per second, hardened is not going to help.
I know, but they have the capability of moving out of the way and stuff. That's
not if they don't know what's
Cheyenne.
I know they do. They have that. In fact, I work with that on a regular basis, but it won't help if you don't know it's coming.
Yeah, but I mean, Cheyenne Mountain is very involved in that. They track that stuff. They
can't see something the size of a golf ball. They can't. And I'm probably talking out of school here, but the reality is that you can bring down somebody else's satellite pretty easily. By bring down, I mean render it inoperable.
But
just by the
you can also launch a new one.
That takes, we're talking months, years.
No, they're building that stuff right now for backup. They are building backup, quick launch. Yeah, they are.
Marsha, I'm pretty well informed on this sort of thing. It takes a long time. Right now we're watching the NROL launch out of the Cape, and there's been several delays just due to weather. But it takes weeks from the time the spacecraft is shipped, the time it's ready to launch at the Cape.
But what I'm saying is right now, what I was reading is they anticipate that there are going to be some losses of their space of their satellites up there right now. So they're building kind of cheaper modular satellites, and they're looking at, this is, not now, this is real near future. And they're looking at private enterprise to get them up quickly. That's why they're very interested in the Falcon 1 and
you mean the Falcon
Google
9?
And all that. One.
Yeah. Well, the one's not built anymore.
The Falcon, the commercial enterprises that are going to get them up.
Right. Yeah. I'm well informed about that. And I can tell you that's only a limited capability right now.
So we're in trouble is what you're saying, Paul.
I'm saying that if you wanted to bring down the entire, the most crucial military assets in low Earth orbit, that the United States or the West in general holds, you could do it pretty quickly.
But then there's this stalemate. Cheaply. There's kind of a sense of a stalemate because the Chinese don't want to make us mad. We don't want to make the Russians mad. The Russians don't want to make us mad. On and on and on. I guess a small rogue nation state that would do that would be about the only scenario I can think of, because Russians and the Chinese don't want to start a war.
The Chinese did test an anti-satellite weapon a few years ago, which is still, the debris cloud from that is still an issue. The
United States have tested anti-satellite weaponry as well,
but not
without telling everyone.
But things are already re-entering, so that they didn't create a mess. Back in the 80s, the Russians the Soviets, I should say, tested a geosynchronous anti-satellite weapon, which created a big mess. And that stuff's never going to re-enter. It's just floating up there. And the, that was really largely a way of saying, hey, we can screw with you if you want to. But the reality is it's not expensive and it's not difficult and it's not high tech to destroy a satellite.
No.
And that also brings us to the issue of the Kessler syndrome, which Sam Lichtenstein, who unfortunately wasn't able to make it tonight, had brought up in a message to the group. Whereas, you talked about the debris cloud from earlier tests, that if you get enough debris at a particular orbit, then it can cascade, and it basically makes that orbit unusable for satellites.
Yeah, you can get to a tipping point where you've created so much debris that, at least for a period of time, some range of altitudes will be unusable. There have been lots of unintentional contamination of space that. Now, fortunately, space is very big. You have to create a lot of debris, but so the tipping point, the Kessler syndrome, is pretty dramatically worse than we've seen so far, just by accidental collisions or the Chinese ISAT test. There was an Iridium Cosmos collision a few years ago, where an Iridium satellite collided with a Cosmos. No longer in use object, and it caused a debris cloud to form, but it's not so far as we know damaged any other satellite. So those orbits are still usable, but because space is big, space is really big. But if you get enough of those going off at once in one time, you could get that Kessler syndrome. And now lower orbits, like down where the space station is, clean themselves every year or two. Stuff just re-enters. But above that, maybe above, say, 500-600 kilometers, the cleaning rate is much slower. And so you could really eliminate a lot of that. Now, our weather satellites, for example, that I work on, are typically up around 800 kilometers, way above the sort of the self-cleaning orbit area. So far, as far as I know, no damage due to orbit debris to any of our critical weather satellites or environmental satellites. But if you had a war in space, that could happen. We could lose our weather capability as well as our spy satellites and intelligence satellites and so forth.
Not only could it happen, but it might be purposefully made to happen. Anyway, sorry for interrupting, Adam.
It's all right. I was going to say that weather satellites are very useful to military.
Well, they are because
function.
The military needs to know what the weather is going to be, right? Yeah.
Yeah, of course.
And the low orbiting satellites are out. I mean, we have satellites at geosynchronous orbit, but they don't give us the very high resolution data that we need to make good weather forecasts. So that's what the lower orbit satellites do. There are both American and European satellites doing that. There's also Japanese satellites that are involved as well. And those satellites produce very, very high quality data that the weather forecasters have come to rely on. So yeah, if you were blind about what the weather was going to be, your military operations can no longer be planned as carefully.
They're what they used to be before we had weather satellites.
Yeah, always
subject to suspension and basis of weather unknown.
Yeah, I remember reading about the meteorologists who worked out in the Pacific in World War II, and they had an enormous challenge to try to understand what the weather was going to be, and because there could be a typhoon out there and they wouldn't know it.
Right, and if you look at Eisenhower's decision of whether to go ahead with the D-Day invasion or not, that was another thing that was very fraught and had the input of a lot of weathermen at the time, but they didn't have the satellite technology, so they were taking a gamble.
Oh yeah.
Well, now What kind of platforms are we talking about that are up there now? We discussed the weather. That's important to know what kind of weather systems over an area. And then we've got satellites that are able to have a very, very close-up view of a particular area.
I can neither confirm nor deny that exists.
We know it does. So you don't have to confirm. So we've got 2 of those now. Now, what are the other satellites that are war-making capability platforms? We've got the spy ones.
There could potentially be high-resolution radar satellites. There could be, potentially. There are possibly some, I don't know, hyperspectral satellites that would be looking at, which basically can tell you whatever it is on the ground, whatever's there, or they can tell you what it is, including things like camouflage and recently overturned Earth and so on, which are incredibly valuable for targeting applications, I understand.
And GPS satellites, which
GPS is quite a bit higher orbit. It's in a 12-hour period orbit, which is and there's a bunch of them.
But I mean, they're crucial. They are crucial to the military.
Absolutely.
They're crucial to everyone. And there's actually now a European system coming into line, and there's also the Russian GLONASS system, and the Chinese are putting their own system up. So there's actually 4 constellations roughly in that same orbit that are all providing navigation services, which we all have come to rely on when we try to find, where the laser tag Jim is.
The US-led coalition that won the Gulf War wouldn't have been able to charge through the western desert of Iraq without global positioning satellites.
Oh yeah, well they all have these little GPS receivers, and they were in high demand amongst the commanders in the army.
Very much so, and that they do the modern military apparatus, things like self-propelled guns, tanks, all the aircraft, all the ships, they all need global positioning satellites to work.
Self-driving cars need it.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say the thing to do would be that the enemy would want to be able to knock out specific ones and keep theirs intact. So they're looking at some kind of particular pulse that would knock out everybody's but their owns. I wonder, they've got to be working on something like that.
Dazzling or blinding.
Yeah,
that's one thing that's being worked on.
That's really hard to do for the whole constellation. So I mean, I shouldn't say more than that, but it's very robust. You can knock it out in specific small areas. You can deny, but it's even harder than it used to be. If you look at what's being launched now, the GPS-3 satellites, they are much, much larger and much, much more expensive than the GPS-1 satellites that were launched in the late 70s, early 80s. Those were about $20 million a piece in then-year dollars. They were delivered ahead of schedule and under budget. And they worked for many, many years, way beyond their advertised lifetime. But my point is that the GPS-3 satellites up there now are hundreds of millions. I'm not sure that the exact price, but hundreds of millions of dollars. They are much, much larger. And that has a lot to do with making it harder to deny the service that is presently, being supplied, and making the service more accurate as well.
Well, what you'd want to do is stage your satellites on the ground, throw up something that had a huge EMP pulse that knocked all of your adversaries out, then launch your stuff, and it would be the only thing up there working. That would be my approach.
I shouldn't comment on that, but
There are alternatives that aren't as great as GPS, but battle space management is not limited to the space assets. You can put up AWACS planes and get some kind of radar coverage. You can put up very high flying planes, and you can use a variety of
drones.
I was going
Balloons.
to say drones interconnected and to a ground-based network. They're communicating with each other, can provide pretty good coverage.
It just doesn't have worldwide capability all at one time like the higher stuff does, but it certainly would get you into a battlefield and make you capable there.
Right. Well, I mean, Nick pointed out there are backup systems, and for local areas, which is probably pretty much all that an enemy can do to deny is the local area. There are many possible alternatives, and most of those are probably not publicly discussed. Also, I can tell you that I think, without talking out of school, that the GPS satellites that we have are extremely tough, and they have been since the first generation, because they were meant to operate through a nuclear war, and including a nuclear war that in space. So they're built like brick shithouses, and they are just not gonna, you can't bring them down with
But don't solar flares affect them?
No.
Okay.
They might affect radio propagation, which could result in some inaccuracies, because the atmosphere, all those signals have to come through the atmosphere, right? And through the magnetosphere, so they could get scintillated a little bit. That's an area of active research, but GPS itself is never experienced a system-wide outage.
But isn't it interesting that China Lake, the naval facility at China Lake right now, is, as we speak this month, they're conducting tests that are going to apparently widely affect GPS in the Pacific Northwest. So I wonder what they've got going on there.
Well, I don't think they're going to tell us, but yeah, they're just saying, hey, watch out, your GPS receiver might not work in this area.
Yeah, I wonder if they're working on exploiting.
They're probably working on well, no, they're probably working on some kind of anti-jam technology. But that I really don't know. And they're not going to tell us.
Right. You couldn't say anyway if you did know, or they'd have to kill you, Paul.
I honestly don't know, but I'm not involved with GPS much anymore. Well, actually not at all, except as a user. The satellites I work on all have GPS receivers, and we have a lot of and those GPS receivers have been rock the whole time. They provide extremely good knowledge of where the satellite is all the time.
Well, we've talked a lot about near Earth orbit armament and war-making capacity and platforms, but what's the future of warfare with boots on the ground?
Well, I don't know if you're going to get a lot of boots. I mean, boots anywhere except on Earth are extremely expensive and hard to support. So if they're trying to kill each other like they did in some of Heinlein's early novels, where people on the moon were shooting rifles at each other, you're probably it's just a fantasy. I would think it's going to be a robot on robot at worst case. Marsha, we're losing you.
I
can't. You hear me?
Oh, now we can.
Okay, you're back.
We lost several sentences.
It's electromagnetic energy is hitting here as we speak in the form of lightning. But can you hear me now?
Yes.
All right. So I've read that DARPA and other outfits are working on assisted mechanical and hydraulic assisted exoskeleton types of things that soldiers can step into just right out of science fiction that would enhance their physicality. I think they're working on stuff like that. I don't know if the soldier per se will completely go away.
Right. Well, I think you can probably build something like that. The question is, could you build hundreds of thousands of them?
Well, how quickly could you tool up to build hundreds of thousands of them?
Well, I mean,
you just put a lot of them on the printer, the new.
no.
No?
No,
No?
3D printers can do a lot of things, but they can't do everything.
They can't manufacture that type of thing quickly?
No. I mean, it's just not a manufacturing method. The reality is that, DARPA, if you're something that DARPA is working on, that's a proof of concept. It's not, I mean, DARPA does all kinds of stuff that never makes it to the battlefield.
Oh, sure. They're always looking for stuff.
And what they have to find, they're trying to find out is, can we do this cheaply enough to make it work? Can we, maybe we can give it to our elite soldiers, but can we give it to every soldier? I don't know.
Yeah, they do a lot of feasibility studies, and that's what they're interested in.
Well, they like to build hardware. DARPA, I'll give DARPA credit for that. They like to actually cut metal, but they're not just about paper studies. But they do those, but they're meant to be preliminary to actually going and doing some kind of operational activity. But DARPA does not field battlefield hardware.
Like you said, they produce proof of concept.
Right.
But I'd like to point out something overall about this discussion that applies to several things we've talked about already, which is because the United States has technological advantages over almost every other nation state in the world, we tend to be on the expensive side of asymmetrical warfare. And by that, I mean, during the Cold War, we built the huge aircraft carriers, and many of them, and the Soviets built hypersonic missile like the Moscow P-270, I think it is, if memory serves, and the Shkval supercavitating torpedo, which it's easy to build a lot of those very cheaply. And Paul was saying earlier about the how cheap it is to build an anti-satellite weapon, and that's true. It's expensive to put up a really good hardened satellite that can survive a nuclear weapon or lesser direct kinetic attacks, but it's cheap to build the countermeasures. And once again, when you talk about exoskeletons, yes, people are researching that. They're working on it. They're also working on battlefield robots and sophisticated drones. And that's all great hardware. But once again, it's cheap to build the countermeasures. If you can get yourself on the side where you're building the cheap and plentiful countermeasures, that you can maintain military significance even if you're not building the big ticket items. And this is one of the reasons why we will continue to see a role for actual human fighters on the ground, because a small group of people with AK-47s can still do an enormous amount of damage.
Right. I mean, you give me a guy who's willing to die for his cause, who's armed with a cheap rifle, and he doesn't care about his own survival. He's as dangerous as a B-52 because, he can come right up to you and shoot you in the head. And, that has been, and that is exactly what the Soviets did in World War II. They threw enormous amounts of soldiers and material at a technologically more sophisticated German army, and just ground them down.
And lost a lot of people.
Oh yeah, they lost a lot of people. They didn't care about that. Right?
Surgical strikes are important. They always will be. The way you can get in, you can do something real quick without a lot of collateral damage and get out. And that reminds me, I was reading about something else that they're working on. It has to do with the ability to cloak soldiers somehow. They're working on that type of thing. It's not like invisibility cloak, but they're able to try to make soldiers less visible on the battlefield.
Well, people are working on that for thousands of years. I mean, the ninjas are an example of that. The Korean Seoul-sa soldiers were very good at camouflage and cloaking themselves. It's just a modern.
I'm talking about a technology, though, Paul.
Well, this was technology.
Draping yourself in black isn't a technology.
Sure, it is. And especially
it's a technique, but it's not a technology.
It doesn't have to involve electronics. You can have, it would actually be very sophisticated. They would get very, very good at becoming almost invisible next to a tree, next to a wall, and they could very quickly change their camouflage. And these again were people who were not concerned with their own safety. So some of them would in fact fail at this and be killed, but they were extremely dangerous. And they served the purpose that they were sent out to serve, which was to achieve a military victory.
And human beings are intelligent. We don't yet have any machines that can match human intelligence. I once saw an interview with an Israeli soldier who said that a suicide bomber is the smartest bomb there is, and that the suicide bombing is a kind of surgical strike. We don't think of it that way because it's an attack against civilians, but from the perspective of somebody conducting asymmetrical warfare, it's the most intelligent way you can deliver the most devastating strike with the least amount of means if you've got somebody who's willing to sacrifice their life to the cause.
And they have people who are willing to die.
Yes, and many of them.
And they've convinced. I mean, that's a technology right there, convincing people to sacrifice themselves. It's something people have been working on for thousands of years.
And when we think of suicide bombing, we usually think of what's gone on in the Near East over the past few decades. But one of the most devastating suicide bombings campaign was in the Sri Lankan War with the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam, LTTE. They had a very sophisticated program of recruiting and managing their suicide bombers, and there probably are other terrorist organizations that have benefited from that technique.
Probably the most sophisticated suicide bombers ever were the Kamikaze. They were completely willing to do it. They believed that they would achieve some kind of afterlife benefits from it. By serving the emperor in their own death, and they, of course, the Japanese soldiers were legendary for being willing to die even in futile attacks. But they killed thousands of American sailors and sunk ships, so they were very effective. And that. So yeah, I mean the asymmetric. Anybody who thinks the enemy doesn't get a vote is barking up the wrong tree in terms of what technology we pick, right?
Yeah, well, that's absolutely true. The enemy determines a lot more than people want to acknowledge, and that's why I don't know if you folks are aware of the controversy that was going on in the strategic community a few years ago about counterinsurgency warfare, and I wrote a blog post saying, well, if you don't have much, if somebody's going to conduct an insurgency against you, you basically are forced into counterinsurgency whether you want to or not.
Right, and lots of people have found that out the hard way, right? I mean, including the British in the 1770s,
and the French in Algeria. That's the example that's been cited a lot in recent decades.
Yeah, I mean the enemy, if he. He's faced with, can I achieve technological parity with this enemy? Well, if not, which often it's not feasible, what do? Do you just give up? No, you find some other way to fight. And it may be dirty. It may be a very dirty way to fight. It may involve killing civilians, but that's war. War is like that. War is ruthless and dirty.
I was just wondering if we'll ever get to the point in the future where we'll see suicide bombers in space. I mean, let's say I'm talking about maybe 200 years in the future, when we have colonists on Mars, in the asteroid belt, perhaps. Who knows what sort of political systems will be in place? How people will deal with the allocation of resources, money, power, all these things. Unfortunately, we are a warlike species. We've conducted wars for thousands of years. So are we going to carry on?
Yeah, that was going to be my question. Will it always be thus?
Well, I don't know. I mean, we're not killing each other at the same rate that we used to. I think the hemoclism of the early 20th century may have taught a few people a lesson. I mean, from 1914 through 1945 was, and even into the 50s, really, in other places like China, there was a lot of killing going on in organized military fashion, and it just everybody recognizes now that's not really in anybody's best interest, and we haven't had that since, well, really even since 1945.
But the period that you're citing is a paradigm example of peer-to-peer conflict among nation states. So you have standing armies or navies with big ships, or the Battle of Kursk with thousands of tanks on both sides. And you don't see that anymore. I think the era of peer-to-peer conflict between nation states has gone away because of our tacit quid pro quo agreement of human beings love to kill each other so much, and we need to go on doing that. But if we keep doing it at the level we did it in the middle of the 20th century, we're gonna annihilate ourselves and go extinct. So we're not going to use nuclear weapons, and we're not going to use chemical weapons, at least not too many of them, or not too big. And we're going to put the cap on biological weapons, but we're still going to kill people in small wars because that's what we do.
Well, I mean, is that because that's what we do, or is it because there's a few rogue outlaws who do that? I mean, people like, in Darfur but most of the war, all the wars since 1945 have been relatively small, involving relatively small numbers of troops, and quite often asymmetric wars. And I just wonder that, nobody was better at fighting peer-to-peer wars than the Germans. They had the best technology, they had the best soldiers, they had the best generals, and it didn't work for them. They failed at it. It resulted in their becoming completely crushed in 2 wars. And,
Well, it would be debatable then if you could say they had the best this, that, and thus, because if they lost, it's debatable.
Well,
I will agree with Paul, though. They had the best general staffs. They had some of the best weapons, no question about it. They had some of the best strategy, but they overreached. To unwind a nightmare scenario for you, if the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact had held and Hitler had not felt a need, because he thought the Slavs were subhuman, to push into the Soviet Union, and he had just stopped with mastering Western Europe, there would have been very little the United States or Britain could have done to unhinge a Nazi tyranny that would have stretched over Western Europe. And
I bet you his learned generals tried to talk him out of just that.
Oh, of course they did.
He didn't listen.
Well, I mean, there's a lot of people who think that without Hitler there would have been no World War II. Period.
Maybe. Yeah, that there are, obviously that's a counterfactual, and it can be argued either way.
Right. I mean, yeah, I agree with that. I mean, the maybe Japan still would have gone into China, but
well, Japan would have continued its expansion in the Pacific, and the U.S. and Japan eventually had to settle that one way or another. Whether they settled it peacefully or whether they settled it through open warfare is, a question.
Right, but that was actually a relatively small war compared to what happened in Europe and Russia.
Well, not all. Some aspects of it where Midway is the only major carrier engagement that's ever happened on the planet, where you've got aircraft carriers on both sides sending out all their planes to attack the other side. So that's a unique event in military history.
Right.
I don't think you can call that small.
But yeah, nothing like the Battle of Kursk.
So dropping nuclear bombs on cities is also a unique event.
Yeah,
a small
true.
detail.
That's true. And the battles around the time of Guadalcanal were very ruthless. But it's true that there was nothing the size of Kursk, the tank battle of Kursk. Nothing like that happened in the Pacific theater.
No Kursk, no Stalingrad, not even Battle of the Bulge.
But notice these are all major land battles. In the Pacific, the big battles were Guadalcanal and Midway and things like that, and what is called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, because by that time the Japanese basically defeated.
Yeah. Well, I believe our greatest casualties were at Okinawa, but
clearly the wars now are to incapacitate and not completely poison and destroy an area. It's the incapacitation of war-making capability that most everyone seems to be interested in, not huge loss of life. Wouldn't you agree?
The trendy term for that is A2D2, anti-access and area denial, AAAD. Is to keep people out of a place, but not necessarily defeat them.
Yeah. Now let's put that out in space. Okay. Now, it's a lot harder to put a big military force in space than it is on the ground or in the seas, because just the sheer cost of getting large amounts of hardware and people up there. But then again, it's hard for everybody. So, it might be in the Heinlein novels, you had a few Americans fighting a few Nazi refugees on the moon or something like that. It could be a very, very small war up there, but it could result in claiming vast amounts of, say, lunar territory or Martian territory as a result of just a very brief and relatively low-level military action.
Or U.S. territory. If they knocked out the right things.
Well, I'm talking about on celestial bodies, or even battles for the best asteroids, because recent research seems to indicate that although there's lots and lots of asteroids, there's only a few that are really the best for mining, and so there might be some. There are probably enough asteroids for everybody if everybody wanted to get along, but not everybody does want to get along, right? Or there could even be corporations battling other corporations.
Yes, yeah, sure.
Hiring mercenaries to people who like killing and to come in and do the dirty work.
In other forms of warfare, but of course there have always been private companies that, in the right circumstances, will hire mercenaries in order to ensure a particular outcome. There was just a news item I heard in the last week of Chiquita was going to be sued by some people because they had apparently financed a militia some decades ago that had killed people in order to try to keep the fruit flowing in banana republics.
Yeah, well, I
can believe that.
A lot of what we think is a political conflict is often fueled by money coming from.
And sometimes you can't tell the difference between a political conflict and money conflict. Sometimes they're the same thing.
And sometimes governments use private enterprise to do their war proxies, so they can try to have plausible deniability, but it's entangled.
It is. Obviously, when you've got ex-special forces serving in private companies that are doing security services, and then they don't have to be reported on the books as soldiers on the ground, it's a really robust plausible deniability. And then on the other side, there were many people who noted that Russia's actions in East Ukraine around what's now called the Donetsk People's Republic, that some people said that, quote, Putin played a master's hand, unquote, in his plausible deniability of putting soldiers in East Ukraine and not having any insignia on their uniforms and not having their weapons traceable back to Russia, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
I don't think he really fooled anybody, did he?
No, but he maintained the plausible deniability on an official level. No.
Yeah. You couldn't catch him at it, so he got away with it. You couldn't pin it on him.
Yeah, and the Ukrainians realized, okay, this is a fight we can't win, so they bailed from that, and they thought their fight a little bit further west.
Where people were sympathetic, the people in the far east of Ukraine wanted to be part of Russia.
Mm-hmm. Well, that the complex history that area's had it's got to have some implications. Just like the fact that the people on the Falkland Islands don't want to be part of Argentina, even though it kind of makes sense that they're quite a bit closer to Argentina, but they speak English and they don't want to be Argentinians.
Paul, your scenario about having troops out in space, how far in the future do you think that would happen, that we would have actual troops that would, like go out with an enterprise, a commercial enterprise, and be part of their security and that type of thing?
Well, probably not that far, but we're talking about very small numbers. I mean, the cost of sending a large military force into space is so high that no side will be able to do it meaningfully. Nobody will ever be able to say, hey, look, I need to spend this huge amount of money to go protect an asteroid. Nobody
that could change.
Nobody will do that. But I think that, well, what scares me is that somebody will decide we're going to do this on principle. We're going to, it's like what the movie Pulp Fiction, where John Travolta says, I'm going to shoot him just on principle. Right? A man who didn't have many principles himself, but they may say, look, we're going to defend our property rights in space no matter what, and our property rights extend to anything we want it to. And that may result in other nations backing down because they don't want to deal with, the bloodshed and the damage, and it's just not profitable to deal with. It wouldn't be profitable for the aggressor either, but it may establish their dominance, which would allow them to, in the long run, to become the only profitable venture.
Yeah, I can probably see more plausible would be commercial enterprises who would have their little militia that would go along with them for whatever reason.
Well, remember, we live in an area of crony capitalism where nation states and big businesses are the lines are pretty fuzzy.
Yeah.
Right, even in China and Russia and everywhere else too, in the United States, in Europe, and there's not many pure businesses that that reach a certain level of power and glory that don't have some kind of connection to the centers of power in their nation. And,
that's said about Google right now, that Google is almost an arm of the government in a way. How cozy they are and some of the things they're doing. I don't know if it's true, but yeah, I
think they're less cozy than some other businesses, like some of the banks in Wall Street and
sure.
And I don't really know all the details of what Google does to I mean, every big company lobbies, and every big company tries to gain influence.
Just the information that Google can supply to arms of the government that are interested in finding out that type of thing.
They supply that to everyone. They don't just supply it to the government. As far as I know, I mean, it's entirely possible there's a Google Federal somewhere that supplies special information to special branches, but I doubt it. I really do.
I wouldn't be
But-
surprised, but who knows?
But we already know that some hardware produced by U.S. manufacturers had back doors built right into it out of the factory. And after this came out of this, after the Snowden revelations,
Yeah.
some people started buying their hardware from non-U.S. companies because they knew the stuff bought from the U.S. had a back door built in because the U.S. government demanded it of these hardware suppliers.
Exactly.
Well, yeah, I mean, if you do your encryption in hardware, which actually the government requires, if you're doing government work, they require the encryption to be in hardware in many cases, but most people do it in software now because software is fast enough. So it's not necessarily an issue anymore. There were backdoors, and I believe RSA got caught with their pants down, among other organizations, with connections to U.S. intelligence agencies. So, yeah, I mean, but I don't know that I'm not really willing to name any specific company like Google or Apple or anyone like that. I mean, Apple recently fought the FBI trying to hack into an iPhone.
Yeah, Apple did. Apple fought that.
Obviously, the fights that we hear about it are the ones are made public. But if you just go back a few decades and read what happened during the Cold War, it's shocking to know how many prominent writers and academics and celebrities were on the payroll of all the world's major intelligence organizations. I mean, it was pervasive.
Sure, and in the Cold War, it almost seemed like it was necessary, right? I mean, there was a certain, like, we're at war, and we have to do whatever it takes.
So your assumption is it's less pervasive now. I don't make that.
Well, I don't know that. I certainly don't.
I don't know it either. I'm just guessing.
But certainly, I wouldn't call it an assumption at all. I just say
it's just extremely sophisticated now.
I mean, we know that AT&T was heavily invested in helping out the NSA. Probably other communication companies were as well. They get paid a lot of money for their federal contracts, and that's got to be a motivation. So, take that for what it's worth. But the point is, right, that there's a fuzzy line between many of the big private companies and the governments under which they serve, or that ostensibly serve them, but it could be the other way around. So you may have a mining company, an asteroid mining company that is tied in heavily to the Chinese government, for example, and the asteroid mining company just says, well, we just want to mine asteroids and bring home the resources, but the Chinese government says these guys have exclusive rights over XYZ asteroids. And who's going to stop them if they decide to make a military fuss out of it?
Well,
Right.
Chinese are already doing that to some Japanese islands and Korean islands, so they could certainly do that on an asteroid.
The Chinese are building their own islands.
Yeah, in contested waters.
Just to sort of make the point, it's kind of passive aggressive in my view, but it still.
It's expansionism. There's no doubt of that, and they will do the same.
The island doesn't really buy them
space.
anything economically, or
it's an air base. It's an air bases are the bases of air superiority in the present world.
Yeah,
having a chain of air bases around the world means you can launch fighter planes from closer to the theater.
Well, right. I mean, militarily it kind of makes sense, but I mean, it doesn't benefit the Chinese economy at all to have those islands.
No, it's being done for military reasons, not because it benefits the economy.
Hegemony, yes. Yeah, it'll happen out in space too. The same thing we will carry, because the human being is not going to change. I don't know that we're going to change in any respect that is going to stop us being what we are.
But changing human beings is even more controversial than engaging in warfare, because obviously when the technologies advance to the point where we can pursue a robust program of transhumanism, most people find that to be a moral horror. and would probably rather see people kill each other than have aggressive instincts reduced and or something like that.
Yeah, well,
Maybe. I don't know.
I haven't seen that kind of revulsion yet. I mean, we talked about CRISPR-Cas9 a little while ago, right? And
Last time.
and
yeah.
that's essentially that gives us the ability to essentially eliminate genetic diseases. I don't know if you call it transhumanism, but
And
I'm not.
We could design traits too, you know,
Well-
not just eliminate. Designing traits is what Nick's talking about. We could design traits that would take out people's aggression and
Well-
some other little aspects of people. Sure, that's
Gene
absolutely-
editing cannot do everything. It's not a.
No, but it's the thin end of the wedge, and that's how major changes always happen in society. Is nobody objects to, small things. But we've been engaging in technological behavior that could be called transhumanism ever since we've engaged in scientific medicine and heart valves and kidney dialysis. And all that sort of
eyeglasses.
Eyeglasses, for that matter. Yes.
Bicycles.
And people generally don't object on that level, but as it gets more elaborate, the level of objection changes, and when you start talking about changing human nature, I think there'll be a very significant backlash against that. In fact, you can find people like Francis Fukuyama who are very strongly against it, and many people agree with him.
Right. Well, I think that there's a level of shock, and then we settle down into it. Right. I mean.
But science doesn't even know what they're holding. They don't even know that the vast capabilities of this nascent technology of CRISPR editing.
But let's look at something.
Where it's going to go.
Something that happened a generation ago, which was test tube babies, right? In vitro fertilization.
Yeah.
It's now so commonplace. Nobody objects to it. Not even the most ardent pro-lifers have a problem with it. Or nobody says we're playing God.
That's because there hasn't been immoral action there. If you're talking about, take China, for example, they had an immoral action. It wasn't high tech, but they were aborting female children, which has resulted in a terrible problem over there with not enough females. So that wasn't a highly technical thing, but it was an immoral action.
I read just today that they've banned interracial marriages for females only. In China.
Yeah, they're stealing women from Vietnam and from Korea. They're stealing women because they just don't have any women there. In China.
The males can marry anybody they want, but the women have to marry another Chinese.
And that was real low tech, but it had a huge impact. And and the world did bemoan that, but it didn't stop it.
Right.
China was also involved in executing criminals and selling their organs, but they've since stopped that practice, at least officially.
Yeah.
Oh, I mean, I can't get those organs anymore. Damn.
Time to shop around.
I need organs.
I guess India is a place now to go for organs, as there was a scandal last week about selling kidneys, I think, in India.
Yeah. Well, But my point was that we kind of a lot of the so-called moral objections to what technology can do with our bodies.
It's a moving target.
They fade over time, and we're getting to where stem cell technology can now save a lot of lives.
Sure.
And maybe even reverse terrible diseases. And I don't know if it'll work with, say, Alzheimer's, but anybody who's ever had a loved one who's gone through Alzheimer's will welcome anything that works. Trust me on that one.
Yeah.
That's true. That's true, and I don't disagree with you on that. But I think we have to understand the way that the media builds up. Like you talked about the example of in vitro fertilization, which is now routine. And that's true, but when it first came out, it was extremely controversial and it made a big splash in the media. But it didn't really change human beings. It didn't change human nature, and it was basically it's a reproduction therapy in the same way that the CRISPR technologies can be therapies for various diseases and can cure people. And most people, even with pretty out there therapies, aren't going to object to making people healthy again. But when it comes to the point where medical science can robustly change people and produce a class of people who are significantly smarter, significantly longer lived, and
stronger,
stronger,
more intelligent. Sure, yeah, that's
uh,
going to happen.
that is going to create a social division because it's going to come to the wealthy first.
Well, yeah, but I think it won't really be significant until it's available to the middle class, though.
Which is rapidly shrinking, so forget about that.
You've already noted earlier about the amount of wealth concentrated at the top of the income pyramid. If these technologies of human enhancement comes to the wealthy first, it's going to serve to further concentrate wealth at the top, and that's at some point that becomes unsustainable. If wealth inequality is a political issue now, it would be made much worse if the people on the top actually are smarter and longer lived. If you have to die young.
I don't see how smarter, longer lived people are a problem. That sounds like a resource to me.
Well, yeah, but if they take everything for themselves and give nothing to the people on the bottom, that's when you get a revolution.
Well, why would they do that? I mean, what's their motivation?
Look what's happening in the world now. I mean, incomes have been stagnant for vast majority of people in the industrialized world for decades, while the people on the top are making more money than they've ever made in the past. There's a very interesting experiment that was conducted in behavioral economics a few years ago, where they have two people, and you give one of them an amount of money, like $20 or something, and then the person with the money gets to offer to split it with the other person. And usually the person who given the money, they offer to split it like 50-50 or 60-40. And the other person has the opportunity to either accept it or reject it. And when there's a 50-50 split, the second person almost always accepts it. And maybe 60-40, where they get only 40, they might accept that too. But when you get to the point where the person with the money only offers like 10% and they want to keep 90%, the vast majority of the people will take nothing rather than take 10% and give 90% to the other person. And that's what we're seeing played out on a large social scale now, where the people on the top have so much compared to the people on the bottom. There will, if that trend is not stopped, there will come a point where the people on the bottom would say, we would rather have nothing than see the people on the top get everything.
I don't know about that. I honestly don't. You know, way back in the turn of the century, the concentrated wealth for just a few people was true also. But most people got along, and since they were capable of working and making their life better, not become a gazillionaire, but if they had the means to work at enriching their lives, they would. And they didn't care that Rockefeller had a gazillion frappin' dollars. All they cared was that they had an opportunity to work and advance themselves. Now, when it comes to this thing about CRISPR technology and just the rich people to do something, I don't know if I buy that either. Take, for example, laser eye technology. Just the rich people didn't get their eyes fixed. You've got people of all stripes and financial situations now who can afford to get their eyes fixed because it's a very affordable technology.
Yeah, and there's nothing about CRISPR
not just the rich.
Nothing about CRISPR that indicates it's going to be incredibly expensive.
No, it's not. I don't think it's going to be. I don't think it's going to be a case of where the rich are going to get all the enhancements. In fact, the rich aren't doing transhumanism now, really, Nick. It's just a bunch of geekoids that have a few silver coins to rub together.
I think insurance would pay for it because, I mean, the trade-off is a child with a terrible genetic disease that will cost a lot of money to treat, or CRISPR, right? That's an easy that's an easy decision.
Yeah,
precisely because it's an easy decision. It's a non-controversial decision. No one's going to oppose that.
Right, and I think that will. I mean, the notion that you can make somebody or more intelligent by editing one gene, I think that's spurious. You're going to have to.
No, but as Marsha pointed out earlier, it is coming eventually. It's just a question of how long it's going to take.
Yeah, enhanced capabilities through gene manipulation is going to happen.
Well, first of all, genetics really just gives us tendencies. It doesn't really give us a defined phenotype. So you can't you're taking a lot of risk when you play around with a particular genome. And you may end up with something like the Winklevoss twins, right? Pretty bright, physically perfect, but so what?
Well, yeah, they're going to make mistakes, but they'll perfect these processes, Paul. It's just because they have a few people with two heads or two extra arms, they aren't going to stop doing it. They're going to perfect.
Well, they're talking
technique.
about parents deciding, what risk you're going to take with your child. That's kind of really where it comes down to.
Well, we have the state controlling what risk we can take all the time, and like being forced to wear a seatbelt, which I absolutely hate.
Right. Well. But I make my kids strap in, even though I don't care if they're not going to get pulled over because my kids aren't strapped in. But I also try not to text while I'm driving, not because it's illegal in Maryland, which it is, but because I know it distracts me. So what I guess my point is that gene editing is coming. It will be here soon, and
it is here. It is here.
Well, I mean, beyond just the lab sort of applications we're seeing now, but we will have probably in next few years we'll have the first child born with edited genes.
They've already been able to cut out and stop the retrovirus and HIV. It's just already here. It is galloping. It'll be interesting to see how it shakes out, but it is huge.
I remember what a big news story it was when the first test tube baby was born.
And cloning too. You remember cloning? I don't think they're doing too much in cloning because it didn't turn out to be all that.
Well, cloning doesn't really do anything other than make a genetic copy of another person, and there are risks in cloning. There are risks in cloning. So
there are risks in everything.
But I mean, what I want to there are people that I would like to see more copies of. Yes. Those are probably not the people. Those are probably not the people that make copies of themselves. But
that's the fallacy of cloning. You don't get the same person. You get the same makeup, but you don't get the same person because they have different minds and experiences.
You get essentially.
You can't transfer all that. You're just making a physical exact copy, but you cannot transfer the mind.
Oh yet. Yeah, everybody knows that. But I mean, a clone is essentially a genetic twin, but 30, 40 years younger, right? So, you could clone yourself, and I would have no objection to somebody cloning themselves.
My wife, my husband would.
Well,
he would think, don't clone my wife, but yeah.
I would not clone myself because I think my genes are much better off being mixed with somebody else's. But there are people. I can think of 3 or 4 people at least who I would like to see more of, genetically speaking. But that's and you could get super athlete. Let's you could genetically clone Michael Jordan. You get a whole basketball team of, But that sort of thing is not. I don't think it's really that big of a deal with humans. It works. We know we can do it. The technique exists. It's probably been done already, in my view, just very quietly and very not publicized. But you get a baby, you don't get another adult. So the baby still has to grow up and be raised and so on. And then, of course, the aliens claimed that they had cloned somebody, but nobody believes that. But with CRISPR, you've got a completely different thing. You can take and make something different from what the source material is. And I think in the next 5 or 6 years, we'll probably see the first baby born with edited genes to take out a genetic disease.
Yeah.
I can see that happening. It's been done with human embryos, but the embryos were not viable. So it's only a matter of time.
Yeah, and it's going to be a self-policing effort in the biomedical industry too. I think so far self-policing has been quite appropriate. And
but you can no more prevent if the technique is cheap enough and easy enough to reproduce, you can no more prevent it than you can prevent cocaine smuggling. It's going to happen.
Yeah.
But you can make it more difficult and more expensive.
You can make it a little more difficult, a little more expensive, just like you can make, most of the guns in Chicago are illegal, but people still shoot each other in Chicago, right? And it's only a little more expensive to get a gun in Chicago than it is in, say, Colorado Springs, but not that much more.
Where there's a will, there's a way.
The will exists, obviously. And if somebody says, I don't want my child to be born with the same terrible disease that my sister had, and I know that I've got one half of that gene, my husband has the other half of that gene. If that embryo has that gene, we're going to take it out. We're going to edit it to a healthy gene.
And as I said earlier, I don't think very few people object to treatments that give people full functionality and prevent them from having horrible diseases. That's not where.
But there's really no bright line between that and saying I'd like my child to have blue eyes.
That's right. There's no bright line, and we can continue to incrementally encroach upon that until consequences follow from crossing a line that people didn't even realize was there.
Yeah. Or you may say, I wish I could dunk a basketball, and I'd like those genes for fast twitch muscle. And, maybe my kid can dunk a basketball, and it can go from there. Yeah, sure. And, frankly, it's going to happen. It will happen. And we can have all this hand wringing about ethics and whether it's good or bad for society, it's still going to happen, just like cocaine happens.
But sometimes powerful nation states can be very successful in repressing technologies. I read a very frightening article, I think it was in the New York Times last week or the week before, about the success of China and its Great Firewall. And you've got a population of 1.3 billion people who have an extremely censored and edited view of not just themselves, but of the history of the world. You can't access Wikipedia, you can't access a lot of blogs, you can't access Twitter or Facebook behind the Great Firewall. And I personally know people who were in China during the Tiananmen protest, and I was told last week how disappointed they were when finding out the younger people in China who have been born in the 27 years since then, they don't even care about it. And it was a life-changing event for those who were there.
Right.
So China has successfully repressed a social memory.
Well, maybe. I mean,
very Orwellian.
For several decades. Okay, at some point it's going to come to an end. We know that. Just like we knew that Soviet tyranny couldn't last forever. But as I wrote in a blog post once, tyranny can't survive, but that doesn't mean it's going to be replaced by democracy or an open society of any sort.
Well, that's really up to us, right? I mean, we have to make that happen. And as somebody I knew once said, you don't give anybody freedom; they have to take it without permission. And that's pretty much, if you're not in that mindset of not asking for permission, you'll never get freedom.
And it's that kind of defiance that lies at the basis of all the insurgencies we see around the world. So instead of peer-to-peer conflict between the major standing military forces of nation states, you've got nation states that are basically uncontested on that peer-to-peer basis, but you've got small groups of people that are saying, I'm mad as hell and I'm not going to take it anymore. And they pick up a rifle and they get people to agree with them and they try to do what they want.
Right.
But a lot of those things are ideological, and they typically are not economically driven. They're ideologically driven.
No, I don't think that. I wouldn't make that kind of clear distinction, because there's very often there's mixed motives, and people need to eat. So if they have a reason to believe that conducting violent military operations are going to help them eat better, they'll probably find a reason to justify it.
Okay, Adam, want to weigh in on any of this the moment?
Yeah, sorry, I've been a little bit quiet. I was just thinking about weapons in space. Do you know that there are guns in space right now?
Well, the Soviets used to take what, revolvers or something? What
Yeah, they still do. They
Oh.
carry a pistol in the Soyuz capsule as part of the survival pack. Standard equipment for a Soviet cosmonaut.
Oh, well.
And I believe that some American astronauts are offered a pistol depending on their military experience. If they are able to use one, if they have experience, then they're offered one.
What, in case some cosmonaut goes nutsoid? You have to
Well, no.
do a summary.
Well, that's just what I was thinking about. You know, it's ostensibly they're carried to be used to fend off wild animals if their capsule back to Earth goes wrong and they end up, you know, in the Arctic or somewhere wild.
They all come down by the Soyuz right now, which lands way out in the wilderness, and
exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
But I mean, is there a certain amount of paranoia behind taking a pistol up to space with you? I mean, no one's ever used one, as far as I know. But are there secret plans? You know, should the US and Russia ever go to war, what will the astronauts on board the International Space Station do? You know, will the Russians try and cut off their section of the space station?
Well,
Or,
I mean,
you know,
there's no incentive to take over the space station. It's not militarily important.
It's not. The Russians have experimented with railguns in space, which there's not a lot of information about it. They said that they tested railguns as a means of defense against space debris. But is that the real reason, or have they?
No, I'm sure that's not the real reason.
No. So there are weapons in space right now. Weaponization is the first step down the road to fighting battles and conducting war. There's only one country in the world that has expressed a desire to further weaponize space, and that's your very own country, the United States. Every other country in the world has expressed publicly a desire for peace in space, but
Really,
the United States has never signed up to any of the United Nations. What is it called? It's the Outer Space Treaty.
Well, we are kind of signed up to that. I mean,
well, no, they're not.
Well, we would have a hard time violating that, put that way, politically speaking.
Well, the US is the only country that voted against the Prevention of Outer Space Arms Race Declaration resolution back in 2000, 2004, again 2006. The Israelis abstained. The US voted against it. Right. 163 countries voted for it. The US, Israel, and strangely Micronesia are the only countries that voted against it. The US military have quite publicly expressed plans to go ahead with weaponizing space and are actively looking into ways to fight wars in space.
that sounds like us.
Yeah, well, it's simply because the US has dominance in space. It's the only country that has an orbiting space plane as part of its military, you know, the X-37B.
Mm-hmm.
No one else has anything like that.
Yeah, I was going to.
Yeah,
Sorry.
go on, Marsha?
I was going to say, if the Russians were top dog, then I bet you they wouldn't want to sign off on the thing. And if the
Well,
Chinese were top dog, they wouldn't want to sign
the
off.
Chinese have done anti-satellite weapons tests. We have not. So, I mean, except for, things are already re-entering. So,
I've seen video of an F-15 fighter firing an anti-satellite weapon.
oh, well, yeah, but we haven't actually created a debris cloud with that.
No. No.
So, I mean, in terms of the, the reality is that major powers, if it's in their interest to take military action in space, they will do it regardless of what the treaties say, regardless of what the United Nations resolutions say. And I think that's the reality we have to address.
And they will always endeavor to maintain superiority. They are not going to give up superiority. So whatever group is ahead doesn't plan on giving it up.
Yeah, I mean, non-aggression pacts are only as good as the balance of power.
Yeah.
But there's an underlying assumption that this is an escalatory behavior, but sometimes this can be highly stabilizing if one power is acknowledged to completely dominate space or air, and nobody else can challenge it, and they maintain that superiority. Then you get a peace that follows from that because nobody can challenge it.
Like a Pax Romana, which but that will eventually break down.
But if it could give you,
I was going to say the problem is that the Chinese, the Indians, even countries like Iran, North Korea are all trying to catch up.
Japan, yeah.
Yeah, so if it could be dangerous, it
could be. It is. It's going to be.
Many people see places like the South China Sea as a major flashpoint, but that could equally occur in space, particularly in orbit around the Earth. That could be the next flashpoint that kicks off a war.
Well, the thing is, low Earth orbit isn't by itself terribly valuable, except as perhaps an observation platform. But when we start to bring resources home from deep space, then it may be too late for anyone to use military force to monopolize that. But and as I've noted before, way too expensive. I would like to move now into our recommendation section of our show, since we've been talking for an hour and 27 minutes. So, who wants to go first?
Well, I would recommend that people read up on DARPA. It's existed since 1957, 1958, and it was a response to Sputnik, to the Russians beating us to space. They didn't want the U.S. to be caught with their pants down again, so DARPA has done a lot, and if people read about it, I think they'll find it quite interesting.
Okay, how about you, Nick?
Well, I could make many recommendations based on the content of our discussion so far, but I'm going to stick with my pre-established recommendation, which is a philosopher by the name of Alain de Botton has a 2-hour documentary based on his book by the same title, Status Anxiety, which is free to view on YouTube. So I would suggest people view that. It's well worth watching.
Status Anxiety. What's the name? How do you spell that again? Botton?
Botton.
Okay.
I think it's 2 T's. It might be 1 T. I have to look it up.
Well, we'll have links in the show notes, of course. How about you, Adam?
I'm going to recommend something slightly more lowbrow. I've recently been exploring the Star Wars universe, galaxy. I've been listening to the audiobooks of a lot of the Star Wars stories.
And the ones that I particularly enjoy were the Darth Bane trilogy, which is set about 2,000 years before Luke Skywalker. It's the origins of the Dark Lords of the Sith. You can find them on YouTube. It's a 3-part trilogy, Darth Bane. Good stuff.
Okay, it's up to me now. I'm going to recommend something having nothing to do with tonight's discussion. What I'm going to recommend is something called Raging Bitch, which is a beer, actually a Belgian-style IPA, which recently was the subject of a lawsuit about the art that they use on the label of this bottle of beer is by Ralph Steadman, who's probably famous for his gonzo art. And it shows a angry female dog, which is what Raging Bitch is referring to. This particular label, I believe it was, let's see, it was a town in Ohio.
Michigan.
Michigan, sorry. Yeah. Damn Michigan. What it tried to, yeah, what was the name of the town? I'm trying to,
I can't remember the name of the town.
I guess it was the Michigan Liquor Commission.
Yeah, that's right. They tried to ban it.
They tried to ban it because, it's just way too offensive. Well, they won. They won a small judgment against the Liquor Commission as a result of this lawsuit. So to strike, and by the way, I have this beer from time to time, and it's very good if you like beer. But even if you don't like beer, maybe buy it for your friends next time you have a party, because it's a way to strike a blow for free speech. And I think Adam pointed out that there's other beers that have even more dodgy names than Raging Bitch. What was it? What was the one that you mentioned, Adam?
Jolly Old Wanker.
Jolly Old Wanker. Yeah. Yeah, I wonder what the Michigan Liquor Commissioner think of that.
They wouldn't get wanker, probably. That's more of a British thing,
They'd probably look it up on Wikipedia or something.
Yeah.
I'll stick with my Newcastle Brown.
They look it up on early Urban Dictionary.
Yeah.
Anyway, so that's my recommendation. It's actually quite a fine brew, and it's brewed in Frederick, Maryland, which is not very far from where I live here in Silver Spring, Maryland. So, so thanks for listening. This is pretty much wrapping up episode 53 of the Unseen Podcast. If you would like to be on a panel in the future, just send me an email at unseenpodcast@gmail.com. We'll get you on a panel. Not hard at all. All you have to do is have a computer and a very inexpensive microphone and some headphones, and you can join us. And you don't need expensive technology or know anything about recording podcasts. You just have to be able to have some burning questions about the topics we discuss, which, as you've probably heard tonight, range quite widely. It's not all about astronomy and space and SETI and all that sort of thing. It could be anything, really, except for maybe sports and celebrity personal lives. Pretty much the only thing we don't go over. So we'd love to have you.
Thank God.
Yeah, that's covered enough. And we also, if we'd like to hear from you, even if you don't want to be on a panel. You can email at unseenpodcast@gmail.com, or you can just go to the blog, unseenpodcast.com, and each episode has its own entry there, and comment on the episode that you're interested in. Tell us what we got wrong. Tell us what you think. Tell us what you think we could do better. Or maybe if there's a special guest. We have a special guest on every few weeks, and we're looking to have another one soon, so tell us who you'd like to have on. And also, we have we have a subreddit, and we have a Google Plus listener community. So there's lots of ways to tell us what it is you're listening to and what you think and how you think we can do better. And we will read all of that. I promise you. So even if we don't agree with it, we will take it into consideration. So by all means, please do that. We also have a Patreon account where you can support the show if you want to. We don't ask that anyone give us more than a couple bucks a month, but if you would like to help the show cover our costs, we'd appreciate that very much as well. The show is, as we mentioned, a spin-off of the Wow Signal. Go to wowsignalpodcast.com to learn more about that. Wow Signal has been lately just covering Tabby Star, but we're about to branch it back out into more fun stuff, including our old staple SETI and some other things. So by all means, check us out at wowsignalpodcast.com. Come to our blog at unseenpodcast.com to learn more about the show. You can find a list of all the episodes there, and you can listen to any episode you want, or you can subscribe to the show. And there's a link there to show how to subscribe if you want to, or just take your favorite podcatcher, whatever it is, whether it's Pocket Cast or the iOS podcast app or whatever, and you'll find us there. We're on pretty much all of them now. We're also on Google Play. So if you're listening to this podcast, obviously you know how to listen to us, but you can subscribe, and that would make it easy. You get the podcast delivered to your device every time it comes out. Which right now it's about every 2 weeks. So let's have one final round of comments and goodbyes from our panel. Start with Adam.
I'm afraid I'm quite pessimistic about the future. On the one hand, I'm very optimistic that we are going to go out into the solar system, colonize the solar system, and eventually journey out into the stars. I've no doubts about that, but I do worry that there's going to be conflict along the way. I'll leave it at that.
Okay. And Marsha?
Well, I know it's a brave new world, and I guess we're just going to have to hang on and go for the ride, because we're going to do what we're going to do and we won't be stopped. But I'm optimistic.
Okay. And Nick?
I will make a synthesis of the thesis announced by Adam and the antithesis announced by Marsha, and say that if we don't destroy ourselves, we're going to go out into space and expand our civilization. And yes, we're going to take conflict with us, and that's part of who we are. And I if we make it that far, even if we bring conflict with us, I think that's great. Not that conflict is great, but the fact that we're still around to be engaged in conflict is great.
Okay, well, thank you very much, our panel of Adam, Marsha, and Nick, and thank you for listening. This is Unseen Podcast, episode 53. Today is the 10th of June, 2016, and we'll see you again in about 2 weeks. Goodbye.